Among the Jewish Americans who understood the urgency of the rise of Nazism were Zionists, and they organized to rescue Jews from Germany under the auspices of the Jewish Agency for Palestine. The Romance of a People, which the Jewish Agency for Palestine supported and sponsored, was the highlight of Jewish Day at the Chicago World's Fair. It was really something that there even existed a Jewish Day at the fair. There were a lot of ethnic days, and we'll talk a little bit about how Jewish Day came to be one of them. But it was the highlight. It would use a chorus of over 3,500 people, colossal stage properties, as you can imagine, amplified sound, the very latest in lighting effects, music that spanned 4,000 years of Jewish history and experience in diaspora. And you may ask, how could a minority population coming under attack, as it was, assert its pride so forcefully at an international exposition? And the answer lies, I think, in the special conditions of the World's Fair that sought to bring the whole world into one concentrated space, but that is also in large part attributable to the men and women who created and pushed the production forward. And so the people behind the pageant, the producers, one really cannot speak of the romance of a people without speaking of one key figure who produced the pageant against resistance and in spite of the gargantuan undertaking it was to create a performance event that would fill Soldier Field. And that was Meyer Weisskall. Weisskall was then the executive director of activities in the Midwest for the Zionist Organization of America, and he was the producer of the pageant. He spearheaded it, and he was perhaps spurred on, he perhaps gained confidence because he had produced a very successful Hanukkah pageant the year before, actually just maybe 5-6 months before. And he felt that performance would be the appropriate representation of the Jewish people at the World's Fair. It was delivered as the Jewish expression of the fair's openly declared overall theme, which was science finds, industry applies, and man conforms. And it profoundly inserted Jewry into the fair's subtextual but omnipresent narrative of the march of human progress. Weisskall's path as a producer was not completely free of obstructions. The first obstacle to the Romance's articulation of nationalist Jewish identity and purpose was a dominant trend in liberal Reform Judaism toward embrace of American individualism as opposed to nationalism, and the figuration of Jewish identity as a chosen religious confession. And this ideation of Jewish identity, focused on cultural assimilation and profession of faith, was on permanent exhibit at the fair in the Jewish booth at the Hall of Religion. And this other conception of Jewish identity, which was focused on cultural assertion and a revival of Jewish national life, became, in fact, the dominant representation of Jewish Day at the fair. A special day in which Jews as an ethnic group, like other ethnic groups, were given focus. Now, luckily, Weisskall wrote about this in his autobiography, which he published in the 1970s. He called it So Far. And he talked about plans for Jewish appearance at the fair and how they were delayed because the Chicago Jewish leaders were divided about the categorical definitions of Jewish community. Was it held together through religious belief and practice? Was it about biological inheritance, distinctive cultural behavior, some sort of combination? Jewish participation in the fair was delayed because there was this undecidability about exactly what Jewish identity was. Still, Weisskall was tenacious, and he gathered a team of writers, prominent Jewish Chicagoans, and performing artists, and he began to pull together the greatest live demonstration of Jewish national identity that had ever been staged. Brandeis professor Stephen Whitfield, expert on Jewish American culture, who wrote a foreword to the 2000 reprint of the fair program that the Chicago Jewish Historical Society put out, and it's beautiful. I highly recommend it to all of you. And he said that the script writers for the fair were apparently the Zionist publicist Maurice Samuel and Chicago's Rabbi Solomon Goldman, plus Weisgall himself. We don't have a written text of the pageant or proof of this collaboration, but there is a synopsis included in the pageant program that describes each episode. And it would seem that if this threesome of cultural Zionist thinkers did collaborate on the script, that they probably balanced out one another's styles. Maurice Samuel was very good friends with Chaim Weizmann and Weisgall, and a prolific writer of both fiction and nonfiction. You may best know him for writing The World of Sholem Aleichem in the early 1940s. Indeed, did a lot of translation work. He had a piercing intelligence, often controversial. In 1931, he wrote a book called On the Rim of the Wilderness, The Conflict in Palestine. And he minced no words in his opinion that held Arab leaders in pretty low esteem. He accused them of incompetence and, at best, greed and power-driven manipulation of their own people. It was a very strong statement that he made. Solomon Goldman, on the other hand, was effusive and excited about the potential for Jewish and non-Jewish cooperation in the United States that the pageant also asserted. And in his foreword to the original program, he started off by saying, "Thank God for Jewish Day. At a century of progress, on the eve of America's great day of independence, the Jew portrays his eternal romance, his romance with God, with life, with ideals." Despite the differences in tone and probably some of their ideas, all three of these men did believe in the to Allen put forward universalism in this Jewish American context of the pageant. So though varied in their opinions and styles, these three men revered Jewish culture and set Jewish history up as Zionist, expressed 4,000 years of Jewish history, Zionist. But he did Jewish history up as a paragon. The pageant's musical director, Isaac Van Grove, was not a practicing Zionist, but he did share these sympathies toward the Jewish people, and in him, Weisgall found an exceptional collaborator capable of composing a score that expressed 4,000 years of Jewish history and of directing over 3,500 performers. According to the pageant program, Isaac Van Grove started his career as an accompanist to well-known artists. And the ideas and the aesthetics of the romance were indeed cohering. Weisgall was managing to gather Chicago Jews who were geographically spread out. He described insofar as having something for everybody. Zionists, non-Zionists, the religious, the nationalists, everybody. But Weisgall's practical mission was to resuscitate Zionism in Chicago and beyond, and to raise concrete religious, the nationalists, everybody. But Weisgall's practical mission was to resuscitate Zionism in Chicago and beyond, and to raise concrete support for Chaim Weizmann's mission to rescue German Jewish scientists and resettle them in Palestine. So as you may recall, there had been a schism in the Zionist organization in the United States when a group following Louis Brandeis' leadership split from supporters of Chaim Weizmann, and Weisgall was in the Weizmann camp. In 1921, Weizmann was elected president of the World Zionist Organization. He visited the United States and, together with Albert Einstein, undertook a fundraising campaign to advance the Zionist cause. In 1925, together with Lord Balfour, Weizmann inaugurated the Hebrew University of Jerusalem on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. And he said on that occasion, quote, "We must create a high culture based on Jewish morality and make it a center of human culture." And indeed, that really describes the thrust of the pageant's content as well. That putting forward the narrative, the story of Jewish evolution from the beginning of time, really as human evolution, right, up to the redemption in Palestine, was the story, par excellence, of human progress. So, placing great emphasis on integrating science and industry, Weitzman promoted the establishment of advanced enterprises such as the phosphates plant at the Dead Sea and the hydroelectric plant at Naharim. However, despite renewed growth, the Jewish settlement was afflicted by an economic crisis, and to overcome that crisis, Weitzman established the Jewish Agency in 1929. Though embattled in 1933, and he had by then resigned his post as president of the Zionist organization, Weitzman was still very much respected. And when Weisgall convinced him to come and speak before the pageant, his participation generated a great deal of interest among Jews in the United States that most likely would not have been generated. So it did help to build an audience. Walter Roth, to whom I am most indebted, relays the story of Weisgall's convincing Weitzman to be a part of the Jewish Day pageant in this way. Weisgall decided he needed a famous speaker to fill Soldier Field, with its seating capacity of nearly 100,000. Can you imagine? 100,000 seats to fill. I now live in Baraboo, Wisconsin. We have 12,000 people there. Everybody knows everybody. Can you imagine being in this group? Who was the most famous Zionist Jew in 1933 and a brilliant orator at that? Chaim Weizmann, of course. Weizgall telephoned Weizmann, who was living in London, and here's the description of it in Weisgall's autobiography. Weisgall: hello, Dr. Weizmann, this is Meyer in Chicago. Weizmann: was, bist du Meshuggah geworden? Have you gone out of your mind? Is Chicago on fire again? Weisgall: no, but it will be when you come here. I want you to come to Chicago for Jewish Day. Weizmann: what's that? Weisgall says, in parens, I explained as fast as I could. Weizmann: what's in it for the movement? Weisgall, with impressive emphasis and prayer in my heart, if you will come to Chicago for one day and make only one speech, even if for only 5 minutes, I will give you $100,000 for any Zionist fund you designate. Weizmann: put it in writing. So Roth tells us that Weisgall promised in writing, indeed, to raise $100,000 for Weizmann's Central Refugee Fund, which helped German Jews to settle in Palestine. And Weizmann agreed to come to Chicago. Weisgall warned Weizmann that he was limited to only one speech, and if he made 2 speeches, the fee would go down to $50,000. If he made 3 speeches, it was going to be reduced to $25,000. He was a very convincing man, Meyer Weisgall, and before he could set any of this into motion, however, he had one more person to convince, and that was the commissioner of the fair. And this was not necessarily either an easy feat. Rufus Dawes was a wealthy businessman, commissioner of the World's Fair. The Dawes brothers had many assets that they had acquired. In May 1933, Rufus was on the cover of Time magazine, which writing about the fair that opened on May 27th. And it mentions in the Time magazine article that when Rufus Dawes, as an American Jewish demonstration of collective will and historic destiny, the romance folded lofty American ideas into its premise for creating a new nation. The collaboration between Jewish nationalist aspirations and an American civilizing democratic mission was also symbolized in the very framing and dressing of the performance's playing area. The enormous expanse of Soldier Field's greensward, and the stage was flanked, this is an image of the stage, according to Bennett, by avenues of 32 steel flagstaffs, from which swayed in the moonlight the blue and white banners of Palestine and the red, white, and blue of the United States. The picture, he added, was heroic. By the way, as you walked onto the main pathway of the fair, the Jewish Palestinian flag was not displayed with all of the other flags of nations there. It was, however, displayed in Soldier Field during the pageant on Jewish Day. And the young people who performed earlier in the day at the Hall of Science were carrying both American flags and Jewish Palestinian flags, which is the flag that we recognize today as Israel's flag. The pageant not only depicted history, of course, it also imagined the future, the redemption of the Jewish nation by its own hand through labor in Palestine. And here we see architect Samuel S. Oman's set design for the romance. This is a theatrical expression of the international style, white and geometric, a utopian tabula rasa. The Star of David illuminated atop the structure representing the temple in Jerusalem was a symbol of the eternal hope of the Jewish people and at the same time an impressive example of Western Electric's technical achievements. Now, a separate two-level platform, which you see in the first picture here, this was floating in the foreground of the playing space, meant to resemble an altar, and atop the altar, to begin the pageant, an oversized Torah scroll was unrolled when the pageant began, framing the entire pageant as a kind of quasi-religious service that was read from the parchment of this Torah. The idol Molech, which you see in this other picture, and please excuse the reproduction of this from a Chicago Tribune article, this was one of the highlights of the pageant, and it's featured in one of the wonderful clips that we have here in the museum right behind us on these computers. I encourage you to take a look. You can see this scene in action. A Chicago Tribune writer reported on a dress rehearsal and described, it's kind of a fun story. It says, Judge Harry M. Fisher, General Chairman of Jewish Day activities, was a solitary figure in the vast expanse of seats during the dress rehearsal. He looked on transfixed as under the last of the drivers, 200 slaves was dragging the huge idol Molech to the stage, on which human sacrifices were to follow bacchanalian orgies. The judge looked at the hideous figure of Molech and some of the feeling of revulsion against idols, which has been built up during the 4,000 years of the history of his race, must have swept over him as he pointed his finger and exclaimed, "That damned thing cost us $8,000. The idol measures 27 feet high.
The question of why the World's Fair Pavilion is a state secret remains. What don't they want us to know?